You may not know it, but you can model anything. Even this little doohickey here. Isn't that right, Ace? I'm Ben Colley, and you are watching Model Anything.
Hey, just hit it with the hammer. Works every time.
Okay.
Hello and welcome to Model Anything. Today we're going to be looking at modeling this air freshener can, particularly this fancy little nozzle here on top. That was easy. Now we're just going to be looking at the exterior features that you can see here. I don't know if there's anything proprietary about the way that this clips onto the aerosol bottle, but it's pretty simple. We don't really need to worry about that. What I'm most interested in for this piece is kind of this organic curvature to it. As a beginning modeler, if I were to come across this, I might be a little intimidated trying to figure out where even to start with such a shape. But as it turns out, it's actually quite manageable, and so it makes it a good test case. Now, this series is primarily targeted towards Solidworks users, particularly maybe more beginner Solidworks users. But with parametric modeling, there are a lot of common features that are used, some common thinking that is used across different programs. Whether you're using SolidWorks or Inventor or some other modeler, you'll see a lot of the same types of tools. You have to use a lot of the same kinds of logic. And so what I'd like to do with this series is to help you to start thinking like a 3D modeler. Although I will be looking particularly at tips and tricks for SolidWorks, a lot of the logic, a lot of the reasoning that goes into this is common to different types of modeling programs. And so I hope you find this helpful. For the most part, we're going to be dealing with some pretty common modeling tools. With this one, I see a Revolve, a Loft with some guide curves, an extrude, a cut. We might use the dome command, possibly some fillets, but there's really nothing too crazy about this. Once we look at the design intent for this, how it sits on the aerosol can, and hopefully have a couple of aha moments, you'll realize that this really isn't that hard of a piece to model. So without further ado, let's get modeling. So I want to start with kind of a high-level plan of what we're going to do. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is we have sort of a natural parting line right here, sort of a flat, that separates this into some basic features. So on this bottom portion, what I'm seeing is really just a revolve that's been trimmed away to get this nice little swoop along the bottom. Because the lid, if you look at the bottle on the left, it's just fitting over that curvature in the bottle. So they've kept the basic shape pretty close to the curvature of that bottle, but then they've just cut away the swoop along the bottom. I'll draw that in. They've come in and cut away this curvature right here. So the bottom half of this is really just a revolve and then cutting away that curvature. And then from that parting line up, I see a lofted feature where it's lofting from this circle to an oval. And then we'll use some guide curves to get from that circle shape to that oval shape. And while I was running through this beforehand, I realized that there were a couple of extrudes, a couple of planes we'll have to deal with to directly match up the way they have the top of this, but it won't be a big deal. We'll get to that. And on top, it's just a dome feature, which SolidWorks makes really quick and easy. So we'll have the big things we'll deal with is a revolved feature, a lofted feature and the dome feature with a couple of extrudes and cuts in there. So not too bad. So let's see what that looks like in SolidWorks. Start a new part. Okay. Now a command that you need to know about if you don't is sketch picture. Within SolidWorks you're able to import pictures or reference images that you can use to trace and model around. And I want to match up the model to the existing part fairly closely. So sketch picture is within sketch space, so I started a new sketch on the front plane, and up here in the command search you can type in sketch and sketch picture pops up right here. So we'll start sketch picture, and I've already taken my picture of that can and cut out the background just to save us some time. Could have left the background in there, I just like to get rid of distractions. So I can go in here in transparency and I can get rid of that black, so that's just a clear background. So now we just have the bottle in here. And we need to scale this kind of correctly, and the way that I'll do that is just take a tape measure to this bottle, get the overall height, and it's coming in about 9 5/8, so we'll say 9.625 for the height of this picture. And I'm not trying to be exact. I mean, this is a produced part. We're not looking to steal anybody's design here. So we'll say 9.625 for the height of this picture, and we'll lock aspect ratio, which will make it scale correctly. And I also want to center this picture on the origin, so an easy way for us to do that is look at the width of this picture, this 2.5811, and these top couple of boxes up here are the location of the origin, the bottom left of the picture. So let's take the width of the picture divided by 2. Just type in 2.5811 divided by 2, and SolidWorks does the math for us. Actually, it needs to be negative of that value, so put a negative sign in there. And then the same thing for the y value. Actually for the y value, I think I want to rest it kind of at the bottom of where this cap sits. So maybe I'll just eyeball that and say negative 5. Kind of close. Negative 6. That's pretty close. And we'll just bump it up so it looks about right. I think that's where I want it. And we'll stick with that for now. Say OK to the sketch picture. And we'll exit the sketch. So let's get started on this Revolve feature. And so we'll need to create a profile to revolve and an axis for it to revolve around. So let's start a new sketch on the front plane. And we'll bring the axis of revolution up from the origin and just make sure this is centered around that. Now the only thing that we need to draw is this lower curve, and we'll close that in, and we'll do this as a solid for this model. We could do this as a surface body and then give it some thickness, but what I want to do is create a solid model and then we'll just shell it out to a uniform thickness on the inside. We'll just create this enclosed profile to revolve around. And I think the best way to do this would just be a spline. But there is one thing we need to keep in mind. We've got this parting line here where we're going to go from a revolve to a loft. And we want to make sure that the curvature is kind of continuous. So what I'm going to do is make sure that the spline starts on a vertical. So it's pointing straight down from this line. And that way it'll be easy to bring up the curve with the loft so that it's just coming straight up from that point. So this is the top of our revolve feature, this line here. So we'll just cut this off right here using the trim tool. And if you'll notice, commands are sort of just popping up for me. It's because I've got key mapping to everything. SolidWorks is highly customizable, and I really like just making full use of the keyboard. It makes for a very efficient and quick modeling experience. I'll be putting out another video here soon called the Benji method, where it breaks down my key mapping method if anyone's interested, and maybe adopting something similar. It's just a highly effective method for modeling quickly. But anyway, so I'm in my trim command. I'm going to cut off the excess here. And I want to use a spline to get this curvature. So I'll bring down the spline. And we'll make this a 3-point spline. Might be able to do it with a 2-point, but we'll just make a 3-point spline. So that means the start point, 1 point here in the middle, another point here at the end. Bring it down to about here. We'll close it off with a line. And remember, we want the top of this to be vertical, so you can control the shape of this spline with spline handles. So I picked the endpoint of the spline, and that activated this fancy little line here with the diamond and the point. And the most useful part of the spline handle is the endpoint of it. It allows us to change the direction and the magnitude of the vector. So I pick the end of that spline handle. And actually I want this to be constrained vertical, so I'll click on the diamond part of the spline handle and click vertical. And so that's constrained. And we'll just use the other spline handles to fix this shape. Okay, so that's looking pretty close right there. Lines up pretty well. So I'm going to call that good. We'll trim off the excess here. And you notice with SOLIDWORKS, when you have a closed-in profile, the default is for it to become a shaded feature. And that's really helpful because it lets you know that you don't have any dangling entities, you don't have any overlapping issues. It's just a nice, clean, closed-in profile. So with that, we're ready to revolve. So I'm going to finish the sketch. Actually, I'll go ahead and put in a dimension just for good measure right here. See what I did there? Measure. We'll just keep the dimension that was there. And we'll finish sketch. And let's revolve that feature. So we'll click Features, Revolve Boss Base. And our sketch is kind of making it hard to see here, but the axis revolution is right here. We'll call that good. So there's a revolve. And we can go ahead and cut in that little swoop that goes in there. So to do that, let's go back in history, bring up the blue bar over here in the tree to before we revolved. And let's make another sketch to draw out that feature. Hello, there we go. So let's go ahead and draw in that little swoop. So that's another sketch on the front plane. Looks like more spline work, so put in a spline here. And we'll do another 3-point spline. And something I ran into when I was practicing this was some zero thickness geometry errors. And that's where I was trying to put the cut right on the edges of this revolve feature. So you'll notice I'm sort of drawing these lines outside the scope, because this is going to get cut away. But I'm drawing the lines kind of outside the scope so we can't run into any geometry errors or things line up too closely. So we'll sort of make sure everything is contained here. Bring this up, bring the spline handle down. And splines just take practice. The more you play with splines, the better you are at sort of figuring out where the spline handles need to go, where your inflection points need to go. They'll just start to come naturally to you. Okay, that looks pretty good, so let's close that in. Another way I could do this instead of making a closed-in profile is I could have just made that a surface and then cut with surface, but it's a little simpler for right now just to deal with solids. So make this closed-in profile, finish the sketch. And we'll come back to that revolve. Scroll down on your tree. And now let's just cut that out. So we'll cut out this feature using the Cut-Extrude command, which I have key mapped. That's why it popped up so quickly. So through all both, because we have this symmetric on our origin. So it's coming from that center plane and going in both directions, just cutting everything it sees. So hit OK. And with that, we've got the bottom half of this lid finished, so it's looking pretty good. And now comes the fun part. We've got to deal with this swoop up to that elliptical portion. So what we need to do at this point, I think I'll actually use a reference sketch to figure out where my planes need to go. So let's start on the front plane, make another sketch, and let's draw in these curves. Now you'll notice there's sort of this cut on the front, and that comes from right here where a hole has been cut for this trigger. From the side, it makes it look like there's sort of this step back, but it is just a continuous curvature that from the side just looks kind of wonky because of the hole that's gotten cut out there. So let's put in some splines. And actually before the splines, I'm going to define where these planes are. So what happens here is we've got sort of a couple of flats here that we need to deal with. The curvature comes up to sort of a hard line here, and then it goes up kind of straight here. Even though everything looks pretty curvy in the picture, it's actually pretty sharp on the real product. So we've got a plane here, and we've got sort of an interesting plane up at an angle right here. We'll make these bottom two parallel and leave that top one just where it is. So these are going to be planes. But now we can draw in the guide curves that we're going to use for our loft. So we're going to be lofting from this circle to an oval that sits on this plane. So we'll draw in those guide curves using splines. So I'll just do that with a couple of 2-point splines. So that means one on the end point, another one on the end point, and then we'll use our spline handles to define the curvature. So bring this out, and if you recall, we need to make this point vertical so that it lines up perfectly with the curvature below it. So we'll pick that spline handle, click vertical. So that's going to match up real nicely with the curvature below it now. And we'll get the spline handle, match it up. So that's looking good, and we'll have another spline coming from the front. So another 2-point spline, point, point, and take these spline handles. Again, let's make this vertical. And fix this. And that's looking pretty good. So this is all just reference here. We're not going to be building geometry from this. This is reference that we'll just use in future sketches. So that's looking pretty good. Let's finish the sketch. And I want to go ahead and draw the oval that goes up here. So that's off of this plane from this line that we created. So to create that plane, it's pretty simple. Since we've got a line in place, what we can do is do a new plane. That's in reference geometry plane. I have that key mapped. So we'll pick this line, and the way that we'll fully define this is to make this perpendicular to the front plane. So pick that front plane, and so it's lying along that line that we created, and it's perpendicular to that front plane. So create that plane, and now with that plane in place, we can go ahead and put in our ellipse. So create a new sketch, and it's already sketching. Oh, there we go. And it went ahead and picked that plane that we created since it was still selected. There we go. So we need an ellipse, and so the next thing I need to do is measure how wide this ellipse is. So I've got some calipers here, and that ellipse is approximately 1.8 wide. So we'll use the picture to define how long the ellipse is, and then just that 1.8 dimension to get the minor axis. So up here in your sketch tools, pick ellipse, and it just needs to be on that line for now. So we'll just set the ellipse major axis so that it's touching these guide curves. So there's the major axis, the minor axis. We'll use the dimension to define the width of that. So actually first let's take that other major axis point, drag it out to our guide curve. And the width is 1.8. So there's our ellipse. and hit OK. And we're almost ready to loft this, but we need to define some things. So I want to create a sketch for that circle. Go Sketch. And use Convert Entities to get that circle, and OK. And we're pretty much ready to loft this. So let's go to the Loft command. Lofted boss base. And we're going from this circle to this ellipse, and we want it to go along our guide curves, so we'll pick that guide curve, hit OK, pick this guide curve, hit OK. And we also want to make sure that it comes up smoothly from the sides, and rather than drawing in more guide curves, what we can do is just use the start end constraints and say normal to profile. So you'll notice that it kind of nicely matches the curvature that's below it now. So that looks pretty good, and I'm going to say OK. And so the hard part of this is over. We've got the revolve and that cutaway. We've got the loft. So next we just need to figure out this top portion. So let's show our reference sketch again to get our other planes. So show, and we'll create a plane on both of these lines, just like we did before, where we'll pick that line, make it perpendicular to the front plane. So hit OK. And all I'm going to do at this point is just extrude up from that ellipse. So we'll say Sketch, Convert Entities, Extrude. And we're going to extrude up to surface. It'll be that plane that we just created. So up to surface, to this plane. And that's good. And for the top of this, we actually want to create a different body because we're going to be using the shell command on everything below. And then that top cap is sort of solid. So we're going to create a new body from this point upward. So the next thing we need to do is to extrude from this face to this next plane that we're going to have. So let's create another plane using that line perpendicular to the front plane. Hit OK. Again, we'll pick this face, Sketch, Convert Entities, Extrude, up to surface, up to this top plane that we just created. And let's uncheck Merge Result because we're creating a new body. So, OK. You'll notice it doesn't completely line up with the picture, and that's just sort of how I drew my guide curve. If I wanted to, I could create a longer oval on this next plane, and instead of extruding up, I could loft up. But really, it's close enough for what I'm wanting to accomplish here. So all that's left at this point is just the dome here on top. And Solidworks makes that really easy. Instead of having to do some crazy surfacing work, we just have a dome command. So let's hide this reference sketch. We'll hide these planes, they're getting kind of messy. And back up to the search command bar. Solidworks has a default setting where you can get to that search bar by pushing W on your keyboard. So sketch, I'm going to type in dome. Not Joan, but dome. And we'll just pick this face. And let me look at the side here. And we'll just match up this dome to what we see on the screen. So 0.2, 0.3 is very close. 0.32, whoops. And that's pretty close right there. So we'll say OK. And I like what I'm seeing here. So at this point, I think I'm ready to hollow out this bottom portion. So we'll use the shell command to do that. And I need to figure out how thick to make this. So I use my dial calipers to measure the wall thickness of this bottom section. And it's about, we'll say 0.05. So I'm going to pre-select this bottom body from the tree over on the left, and I'll click Shell, and we'll say 0.05 is the thickness. and it needs to be open on the bottom. So we'll pick the bottom face here. And since we're picking a face from this bottom body, it's going to know that we're wanting to shell out this lower body instead of that top body. So hit OK. And we'll verify that real quick. And you'll see that top body is still solid. It hasn't tried to shell that. So get a section view here. And some other handy key mappings here. If you want to hide and show a body, just type tab to hide a body and shift in tab to show it again. And that's just pre-built into SolidWorks. And so now we just have some little nitty-gritty details. We do have the cutout for the trigger, and we can do that real quick. So I think I'm going to hide this lower body so we can see it a little better, the way that this cutout lies in here. So we'll put the profile on the front plane and just cut it from the mid plane in both directions to the width of this trigger. So let's create a new sketch on the front plane and just use this picture for reference. So sort of comes from the top of the trigger down to this point. I'll put a fillet up here just to make sure it doesn't cut into the top of this body. So we'll say 0.25, why not? So we'll hit OK, and that's good enough for the profile. And now let's show that body again. So let's cut out this profile, use Extrude to cut. Mid-plane, and 0.55 is kind of the width that we want to use here for that trigger. Say OK. And we're already very close to being done with this. There are some little details we can go ahead and put in a little fillet right here along this edge. It's kind of got a smooth sweep up here. So we'll go to the fillet command and just sort of visually determine we want it to be, how about 0.15? Okay. And we also have a little cutaway in the front here where the spray comes out. And so we can do that pretty quickly. Again, using a reference sketch, we can determine where that plane needs to sit. So on the front plane, create a sketch, and that nozzle sort of sits back, let's say 0.03. And let's create a plane off of that sketch. So off that line, make it perpendicular to the front plane. Using that plane, we'll create the circle that's normal to it. That circle is, we'll say it's a 1/4 inch. So we're going to make a 1/4 inch relief from the front of this where the spray comes out. 0.25. Make sure it sits down this way. So we'll sort of center it a little bit. And we'll take that profile and cut it, go in that direction. And it sort of drafts out, so we'll give it a real heavy draft. So draft outward, we'll make it like 30-degree draft. Okay. And it sort of has a smooth transition out, so we'll give that a fillet. And you'll notice that it doesn't follow the line down to the next body. We have 2 bodies here. So we'll have to do these bodies individually. So fillet that. And then fillet the body below it. Okay. And all that's left is the trigger. We're not going to worry about the inner mechanism of this. Our main concern was just with some of these tricky shapes that we had to deal with. So let's just make this trigger real quick, and we'll do that with a sketch on the front plane. We'll just use an arc. How about a 3-point arc? So there's an arc that goes from here to here. There's a straight line. I know the picture kind of betrays that, but it's a straight line from here to here. Then we'll just use another arc. That's looking good. And you notice I'm not using a lot of dimensions. Everything's not fully defined. If we wanted to produce this, then definitely we would want to define these points better. But since all we're doing is just getting some general ideas, we'll just keep it kind of undefined and simple. So there's an arc. We'll make another arc and make it tangent to that one that came before it. So we'll click on this top arc, the lower arc 2, holding in Control. Click the tangent relation. And we'll just have this trigger sort of floating out in space here. So we'll bring it across a straight line, sort of just a little boxed in profile. And that picture is sort of hiding it, but we have a shaded contour here. We can hide that picture real quick by coming over here to the tree and hiding the sketch where we put that picture. Now we can extrude this mid-plane. And we'll give it a little clearance from that pocket, so we'll say 0.54. Not merging it to anything. And for one last little detail, we'll put the little nozzle up here at the top. So we'll create a circle that's concentric. And you can awaken the center point of that circle just by hovering over one of the circular edges. And that nozzle, about 0.15. Okay, so we'll finish that sketch. And we'll extrude it 0.01 and 0.02. Okay. Okay. And just for fun, I'll throw in some materials here. Okay, so I've added some colors and I've changed the background to sort of a dark background. So if we go to our render tools and take a look at this model with the preview window, and we compare that to our original picture, I'd say that's a pretty good match.
Let's recap, shall we?
So we used Sketch Picture to give us an accurate shape to trace in Solidworks. We used Revolve to get the general shape of the bottom half. Then we did a Cut-Extrude to get the fancy swoop. We lofted from a circle to an ellipse using guide curves and start-end conditions. There was an extrude and another extrude. We made a dome. We did a shell. We made a trigger. And you get the idea. And that's a model.